Welcome to our webinar, The Future of AI Governance, a look into 2024. My name is Karen. I'm a founder's associate here at Enzai, and I'll be the moderator for this event. So we at Enzai are so glad you could all join us today for this important and very timely discussion on the regulation of AI systems. Enzai is a responsible AI platform that allows you to build, use, and deploy AI with confidence. I want to first and foremost thank our 4 expert speakers for sharing their invaluable insights with us at this event. So just to introduce them very quickly, we have Connor Dunlap here. He's responsible for leading and delivering the Ada Lovelace Institute's influencing and engagement strategy on the governance and regulation of AI in Europe. Chloe Audio provides policy and advisory services to leading AI and technology organizations, including Fortune 500 companies, leading trade associations, and AI labs. Martin Coder leads the AI governance efforts at Swift, the financial messaging service, and Ryan Donnelly is one of the founders here at Enzai. And we're on a mission to ensure that powerful AI technologies can fulfill their true potential. So thank you all once again for being here. I now invite Connor to open up our discussion with the EU AI Act, which has been very much on the news now. So Connor, after this latest round of EU AI Act discussions last week, what do you see as the key sticking points, and what developments are you hoping to see from the EU next year?
Yeah, thank you very much, Karen. Yeah, indeed, there was significant developments last week. They found a political agreement on the AI Act, which is, yeah, a huge moment for Brussels, for the EU. Yeah, this would mark sort of the first horizontal regulation of AI anywhere in the world. So yeah, it was a big moment. To your question, you mentioned sticking points. I hope there aren't so many to still emerge now that they have this political agreement, but it's still very possible we'll see some in the technical drafting to come. But yeah, maybe before speaking about sort of sticking points and developments for next year, I think it might be helpful just to briefly sort of mention why the AI Act is important and why we should care that there's a political agreement. So as I mentioned, it would be the first horizontal regulation anywhere in the world of AI. And this is interesting because they actually will ban the use of some AI systems. So it's definitely a landmark in terms of that type of intervention. So they did agree that real-time remote biometric identification used in public spaces would be completely prohibited, for example, besides law enforcement who can still use the technology with some exemptions. So that was where a lot of the focus was last week, sort of how wide that exemption would be. But that's significant. I also think, it's noteworthy that they will ban other types of AI deployments, such as AI used for subliminal manipulation. So I think that gives a flavor of, how strong this regulation can be when it comes into force in terms of actually banning AI uses. And yeah, besides that sort of the prohibited systems, I think underneath this, it's worth briefly mentioning how other types of AI systems might be tackled. So below the prohibited class, there would be high-risk AI systems, and this might make up what the European Commission estimates to be 5 to 15% of the market. So that would capture a lot of public sector deployments of AI. So, in the legal system or used by law enforcement, and then also in other high impact sectors. So this could be the workplace, in education, in healthcare, for example. So that will set some rules around sort of risk management, data governance, keeping human oversight, that I think will be quite important, again, once they come into force. And then maybe here, just to add another category, which is a new addition just agreed from last week. So you have obviously prohibited systems, high-risk systems, low-risk systems, but there will also be a systemic risk category introduced. So this is for what they're calling general purpose AI models. So this could be, for example, GPT-4 built by OpenAI. And there would be some obligations for these more systemic models. Right now, I think, and when you speak of sort of any sticking points, I think there's definitely some issue there because they have used a compute threshold to define systemic risk, at least initially. and they've set quite a high compute threshold in the opinion of our institute. So that's 10 to the power of 25 flops. So which would basically only capture one model on the market, which is GPT-4 that I mentioned. We're also possibly Gemini from Google DeepMind would be captured, but it's not clear yet. So yeah, I think it's very good that this category is being introduced, but maybe in some of the technical drafting to come, we will need to think about, okay, how is there any way to think about how to widen the scope, because regulating one model seems super narrow. And then yeah, maybe to the second part of your question, you said like sort of what is to come and in the EU. I think it's worth pointing out, yeah, like I said, the first probably quarter of next year, there'll still be a lot of drafting the technical language. There will still be stakeholders trying to influence that process. For example, the recitals of the AI Act giving clarification to what the legal text says is still very important. So I think that work cannot be overlooked in the early part of next year. Beyond that, I think a potentially interesting development that came up that was agreed upon last week was that there will be a code of practice for these systemic general purpose AI models. So what that means is basically that there will be a sort of co-regulatory process to set some initially non-binding guidance for general purpose AI providers. And the interesting thing about codes of practice is that there's an avenue for civil society to be involved, and we think that's really important. So I think starting from sort of Q2 next year, it's going to be a lot of focus on the code of practice for GPI models, general purpose AI models. And if this is done well, it could address the sort of democratic deficit, is something that we've spoken about, the democratic deficit of the standard setting process. So yeah, I would highlight those two developments for next year, and maybe a third one, which would be AI liability. So the EU will also work on an AI liability directive that will be sort of interrupted because there'll be elections next year. But I think it's important, yeah, not to forget also liability in this picture. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Definitely, and thank you so much. We'll definitely keep an eye out for all these things to come. I think there's a lot to look forward to in this coming year. We've also so we've been discussing the topic of AI safety in the European context. And for some time, the US did not take a leading role in regulation, but that's changed now with President Biden's executive order on AI. Chloe, could you tell us a bit what is the mood in the US and how do you see this executive order being implemented in the coming year, and maybe how the 2024 presidential election might change things?
Yeah, sure. And thanks so much for having me. And I'll take it sort of bite by bite as Connor did so eloquently. So just to provide a summary, the EO came out on October 30th, right before the UK AI Summit. So it was like, the big week for AI, upon many big weeks for AI, but maybe the biggest in AI policy. And for those of you that don't know, the executive order was the longest and most comprehensive EO of the Biden administration to date. It's about 111 pages. And I heard from others, who have worked in digital policy for a long time, the Commerce Department, Congress, and other public sector leadership roles, that it really was the most and is the most comprehensive EO related to tech or digital policy ever. So it really demonstrates sort of how intentional the administration is being and how proactive they want to be about this issue. The EO activates 50 different entities, with the Commerce Department leading in a lot of the implementation, and particularly over at NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which you may have heard of in the context of their work on the AI Risk Management Framework, which has been sort of a leading voluntary standards framework for AI governance. And the EO also created over 150 new directives, meaning actions, reports, guidance, any kind of rules or policies, agencies creating their own reports to be implemented within the next 30 to 365 days. So the bottom line is that there's a lot of work here to be done. And the reception has been really, really positive. I think that, in my discussions with folks on the Hill and the administration and industry as well, there's a lot of excitement about sort of the roadmap and path that the executive order sets out, and a lot of curiosity about sort of how it will be implemented. but sort of different from previous executive orders, particularly one from the Trump administration on trustworthy AI. There were a lot of directives in that executive order that weren't quite carried across the finish line. And some of these include, cataloging AI use cases, developing different sorts of like risk management guidance for different agencies, the Office of Management and Budget creating a memo with guidance about how to adopt and implement AI responsibly. None of this quite got finalized. And so I think with this executive order, the tone and tenor, there's a lot more focused on implementation. And so we'll see a lot of that and a really sort of whole of government approach on making that happen. One thing I want to mention really quick though too, and sort of just to contextualize the EO, is that before the EO came out, the US government was actually doing a lot of work on AI governance. And while it's true that Congress has not passed a broad sort of omnibus or horizontal AI law like we've seen in the EU, a lot of agencies within and across the government, I'm thinking about the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, NIST itself with the AIRMF, the CFPB, financial regulator here, have put out different types of guidance to sort of address AI harms that are well known. And so all of this work that is sort of newly created by the executive order builds on top of the great work that a lot of these agencies were doing. And so I think it's important to just sort of, remember that work and understand that it really did help sort of inform the direction of this executive order. I think I'll pause there and maybe we can get into some deeper layers as we go through the discussion. But I just want to mention as a last sort of point that the EO really hits on, a broad swath of issues. It focuses on national security as it relates to sort of model access and protecting against sort of future risks. There's a lot of focus on privacy and consumer protection and IP, requirement for agencies sort of in this context to catalog different data sources, including from data brokers, to really sort of understand the privacy implications of where the government is getting data. And that's been sort of a priority, but hasn't really seen much happen in the government to date. And so I think a lot of civil society folks and advocates, myself personally, I'm very excited to see sort of where that goes. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office here will be issuing new guidance on sort of IP rules and guidance on AI inventorship. So that'll be really interesting. And of course, the executive order focuses a lot on equity and non-discrimination issues. So it tasks, leading regulatory agencies in the U.S. government, the DOJ, the EEOC, and others in DHS to sort of come together and say, how are we going to investigate and maybe make new guidance for enforcement of AI harms? We haven't really seen sort of a coordinated effort to do that yet. And so the EO really formalized that. So we're looking here at issues like non-discrimination, discrimination in housing, loan availability, these sorts of things that we all have known for a long time are well-documented AI harms. So it'll be really great to see sort of how the government comes up with an enforcement strategy around these issues. Really quickly, just to wrap this up, the EO also covers labor and worker rights. So it asks agencies to provide some guidance on how they might be using AI systems or how federal contractors are using AI systems in hiring processes. So that's really important. And of course, it also focuses on the security of AI systems. So we all heard about the UK AI Safety Institute. NIST itself has also set up an AI Safety Institute where they'll be doing a lot of work to really interrogate the security and robustness of foundation models, AI models, developing red teaming processes, sort of building on existing risk management processes to really improve the security of these models. So we'll see a lot of really interesting work there. And finally, the executive order really focuses on bolstering AI talent in the US government. So this is a sad statistic, but it's a real one. Only 1% of graduating sort of computer science and AI PhDs in the US join the federal workforce. We have a huge amount of, very talented AI trained people going to the private sector or to academia or like large labs, startup community, whatnot. But only a small chunk of those individuals end up working in the public sector and contributing to public sector goals and needs and making public services better. And so the executive order creates some new rules and changes some immigration policies, or makes small amendments to immigration policies to allow sort of foreign-born US trained individuals in AI to actually stick around and contribute to the US ecosystem. So that's sort of a very, very, very high level roundabout of some of the kind of 6 key themes that are sprinkled through this executive order. And I'm happy to talk about more as we keep going on our world tour.
Definitely, and thank you for that really whistle-stop tour through everything. It's a very good overview, seeing how the US is approaching each of these questions that we've now seen in Europe. From the UK perspective, Ryan, can you tell us what's happening here? I know you've been closely involved in the discussions with both senior AI leaders and the government at Downing Street. Has there been any progress since the AI Safety Summit?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to quickly recap on what's already been done here in the UK, the UK started out with what's called they've called the innovation approach to regulating artificial intelligence. The idea is essentially that let's set this up in a way that it really does establish the UK as a world leader in artificial intelligence. And many of it touch on a lot of the things that Chloe raised there around, promoting talent and making sure that there's not an area of like overburdening organizations within this, and how can the government set up an infrastructure that really promotes innovation around these incredible technologies. That pro-innovation approach has been going on. The first white paper on that was published a couple of years back, and we as a company fed into those direct proposals early on. It started out very much as guidance, and as time evolved, some of the feedback that they received and that we gave was that it didn't really have any teeth, the pro-innovation approach to regulating artificial intelligence, and that was something that they took on board. And I suppose the government then had a choice, kind of like crossroads. It's like, do they regulate for AI or do they not regulate for AI? And I think that was very much an open question this year. So there was a second draft of that pro-innovation approach published this year. They developed what I think is quite a creative, I say there was 2 options there. There may have been a third one down the middle, and they've developed what I think could be quite a creative solution to this, whereby, in summary, the plan for regulating AI in the UK is to push the burden of it onto existing sectoral regulators and say, hey, you are the Financial Conduct Authority or the Competition Authority. You are already regulating for your area. You also should look at how AI is used within your existing remit. And that will involve adhering to a bunch of cross-sectoral principles and making sure that these systems comply with those cross-sectoral principles within your area. They have introduced what I think is quite a smart way of kind of enforcing a bit of this, whereby they're potentially going to introduce an obligation on those sectoral regulators to comply with the cross-sectoral principles, which in a way puts an obligation on industry, because if you're regulated and your regulator is asking that you comply with these principles, you kind of, by virtue of that, are going to have to comply with them. Otherwise, you're going to be in hot water with the regulator. So I thought that was quite creative. There was talk of going even further and introducing an AI bill, and I think the government did definitely consider this in detail. And it was an open question, I think, going into the Safety Summit. And now the Safety Summit was held there in November. And the focus of the Safety Summit was probably very much more sort of like high level, bigger picture, sort of end the world type risks around this technology, which is interesting, and it's a cool debate. But I think it's probably like not the most pressing debate in the area. And there's a lot of like real problems that are here today with these systems that need to be addressed. And I think regulation can help with that. I don't think the summit really did cover. The summit also was, I guess, had a very strong political element to it as well, in terms of trying to showcase the UK as a bit of a superpower in new technologies in the post-Brexit life and all that comes with that. So out the back of that, there was a decision basically to not try and introduce any additional regulation in the UK. There was an additional bill in the King's Speech around self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles. but there's no sort of like nothing like the EU AI Act, which I think maybe people were considering at the moment. There will be a new draft of this pro-innovation approach coming out in the new year. And I've been speaking quite closely with some of the people in DCIT about that. It'll be interesting to see where that goes, but it's very unlikely, almost impossible, I think, at this stage, that would come out as a sort of horizontal piece of legislation like we've seen in Europe. So different approach in many ways. One final remark on this is that sometimes the way that you look at this is one of the biggest criticisms leveled against the pro-innovation approach and putting it on to sectoral regulators is that you've got no coordinating function. There's no like central function pulling this all together behind the scenes. And that could mean that, say, one regulator takes an interpretation of one aspect of this value chain, another regulator takes a very different opposing interpretation of the same question, in which case you've got like a lot of uncertainty in the market there. So I know that's a piece of feedback that the government is working to address in their latest version of the white paper. Let's see what they come out with there. But in the same way, the criticism is almost the reverse sometimes of the EU AI Act, where it's too horizontal, and you need to take account of different specific sectors and the nuances that come in with it. So I see sometimes these approaches getting pulled closer and closer together, where the middle ground is that happy balance between a horizontal approach, but one that takes account of specific industry sectors and all that goes with that. So I'll pause there. That was a whistle-stop tour of what's going on here.
And thank you, Ryan, for that. And I will also say that's a perfect segue to my next question here. So we've now discussed different regulatory approaches in the US, the EU, the UK. And we also know that there's been similar efforts in Brazil, China, and very much around the world. Martin, can you tell us a bit why international cohesion would be so valuable, and what do you see as the benefits of setting global standards?
Tell you a bit about SWIFT and the approach we're taking to grapple with some of these issues. So for those of you who don't know, SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. So we're a neutral, not-for-profit organization which runs the infrastructure for international payments messaging. A cuddly not-for-profit, so cuddly that we're owned by Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and all the rest of them, JPM. And we're very, very heavy on the governance and have been for 50 years, quite a mature organization. And the way we look at this and the way we're talking to a lot of our customers, our big financial institutions, is to say, look, we already have extremely extensive and mature risk management capacities. Under the 3 lines of defense model, we have, vendor management, product governance, data governance, security controls, privacy assessments, etc., etc. We have umpteen committees and processes and legions of people that look at this stuff. And so this kind of already gets us 70% there in order to be, aligned with what the policymakers are looking to see. There may be 1 or 2 gaps in some areas, and it may be a question of using the vocabulary that people like to talk about. So explainability, which in legal terms means like what is a risk, liability, and things like fairness. This already exists in the law, right? Non-discrimination, etc. So it might be a question of looking at that and extracting out of all these many processes we already have, risk assessment, identification, impact monitoring, etc., the management information from all this against some defined metrics for what people are looking to see in terms of responsible AI and AI risk management across the different dimensions that people talk about: fairness, auditability, accountability, accuracy, and all these things, and present that in a way which people in a position to take decisions, senior people in the organization at the exco level, the board, etc., chief risk officer, general counsel, and so on, who don't necessarily have much data expertise, let alone AI expertise, present it to them in a way that they can understand, which is standardized, which is repeatable, and that gives them assurances that they can take decisions on, and also to provide assurances which can be made available to whoever wants them, whether that is the regulator, whether that is customers, whether that is other types of stakeholders. So what I would say to customers out there is don't panic, because certainly if you're a mature institution, you've already got a large amount of risk management capacity to deal with this stuff. And to your point, Karen, about global standards, it's those kind of the culture of the company and the capacity to do generic risk management processes, never mind the content. Okay, AI has got specific content to it and you need to work on that. But it's that generic process and infrastructure you can have in place, which gets you the outputs in terms of the assurances that are available, setting your own standards for what you feel is appropriate in your own context, and then you can repurpose that for whatever the requirements are in local jurisdictions where things may or may not be so important. The other thing you can do is have partnerships with people in different parts of the world, amongst your customer base, amongst your vendor group, with academics, with regulators. You can sit on the boards of working groups and so on, looking at new areas like pet technologies and what are the standards there. And this is the way you can learn more about precisely what the local context is for certain areas, and to repackage the assurances you can provide in a way which suits the local regulators. So I hope that sort of answers your point about the global context. I think Connor was talking about categories and thresholds. I'm afraid this is just the way regulation works. All regulation works like this. They always create buckets, and then everyone always complains that things are in the wrong bucket or the threshold's the wrong level. But they do change them over time. I think it's actually regulators done a pretty good job globally, bearing in mind, to Chloe's point, they don't actually have all that much expertise in this area. And why would they? There's some poor little policy officer that sat there in the Berlaymont trying to craft this stuff out, who hasn't necessarily been a machine learning engineer. And so I think they've done a pretty good job with that. And I think we'll see over time that these thresholds are going to change, and there's going to be other ways of defining things, and that this will be the things that people lobby about. I think to this point about NIST that was raised by Chloe, I think that is a key organization. And one piece of advice I would give to everyone is there is so much noise out there about what constitutes best practice in AI governance, how to deal with all the different emerging regulatory standards. It's actually got a lot worse over the last year in terms of the signal to noise, because in fact, I switched into AI 2 years ago. It was a choice between AI and crypto, right? When I went to the crypto events, I didn't see as much integrity as I saw at the people at the AI events, right? Now in AI, there's still lots of people with integrity, but there's also a lot of latecomers to the party that are trying to sell you some snake oil. So it's much more difficult to penetrate through to see actually which organizations you should trust. And NIST is definitely one of them. And the approach they have is very much aligned to what I was talking about in terms of leveraging what you've already got on the 3 lines of defense. And then finally, Ryan, I'll make a comment about what you were saying about the UK. I actually think the UK has been rather smart because in 3 dimensions. First of all, they set up this safety institute. So the whole idea there is to partner with the US. So the UK is going to get to see all the cutting edge foundation models that the US companies come up with, because they're going to be sort of checked by the US and UK agencies, right? So they're going to get that innovation kind of capture and get sight of the cutting edge stuff. Secondly, on standards, because don't forget that the UK is still a member of the standard setting body that is empowered to set the standards for the EU regulation. So in a certain respect, the UK still has a seat at the table when it comes to the standard setting phase of the EU Act. And then thirdly, this point about the requirements of the EU Act for people to demonstrate that they have a risk management system in place, and there are rules, and there's transparency of documentation and all that. Obviously, this is a bonanza for the professional services firms who advise on this stuff. Where are the professional services firms? They're all in London. So I think we might see quite a few of them getting some decent business out of the Act.
It's a really great point. If I can just jump in there and pick up on something in particular you mentioned there around the 3 lines of defense. This is a concept that's going to be like really familiar to you and many other in the financial services sector, and certainly in insurance as well. But actually, a lot of organizations maybe aren't as familiar with putting in 3 lines of defense as a practical way of managing this kind of risk. I've certainly seen, when I speak to people in industry, lots of organizations that haven't built a concept around that. And I just wonder what your thoughts are in terms of how applicable that is in terms of trying to manage this new area of risk in terms of AI. And do you think this is something that other organizations should look to as like a bit of a best standard, best practice around managing this kind of risk outside of
I
financial
think
services?
I think it does depend which sector you're in, but in general, I think the message coming out of the safety summit was to say, look, there are certain sectors that in the history of the world were also considered to be a little bit unsafe, or there were questions around it, people are nervous about it, and now they're not, and they have safety standards. If you look at pharmaceuticals and the sort of phased approach they have to drug trials, and some people are suggesting we should do this foundation models as well, like a phased approach to it. If you look at aviation, transport, right? Nobody worries about getting on a plane these days, where they once did, because you just trust that all the checks have been done, etc. If you look at food safety, nobody worries about that. And that is part of the mission that the safety institutes have, is to look at what are the transferabilities from these sectors that have got advanced sort of risk management models into this AI universe. Three lines of defense is kind of financial services specific, but it still sort of makes sense in a lot of ways. Essentially means like first line is the business, the product owners, they own the risk, and it's their responsibility to identify the risks and identify the controls and put in place the mitigations and deliver them and do the monitoring. So the accountability sits with the business. The second line is all your support partners, so the risk managers, the lawyers, the security people, the data governance people, the cybersecurity people, etc. They give you that domain expertise, and that you work with on a kind of interdisciplinary basis, using workshops to sort of flush out what all the issues are, with the risk managers helping you kind of convene and register and rate quantitatively all the risks against a kind of defined risk appetite for a particular project, and help you monitor that. And then the third line is like the auditors, basically, that will come in and periodically just check that all the work you've done to say in terms of identifying and managing risks is as you've said it is. So that's the kind of conceptual idea. But in general, it's this point about looking at sectors where they're already got advanced safety measures in place, and what transferability have they got to this sector. And it's crucial to be specific to what you're doing, because there's so much noise out there about killer robots and about, I don't know, sexist credit intermediation and racist facial recognitions. These are very, very important issues. I'm not saying they're not important, but if you're running a kind of business to business tabular data back office logistic regression anomaly detection service, then they're not necessarily like these fundamental human rights issues aren't necessarily like the biggest risk to what you're doing. And so sort of cutting and pasting a sort of framework from all the noise about what is and isn't important may not necessarily be the right thing to do for your particular proposition.
Spot on. There's a lot we can learn from all these other areas.
Definitely. So before we go on to the next section, I just want to let anyone in the audience know that if you have any questions that you would like us to ask, please put them in the Q&A in the chat. And if we have time in the end, we'll get to those as well. So just so that everyone knows. I think, Martin, you've touched on a really interesting point there about ownership of the risk. This leads us straight into questions about accountability. I wanted to ask where any of you, where do you think that ultimate accountability in managing a risk lies across the entire value chain?
I'll maybe give this to Connor, because Connor, I know the reason I first came across you was because I saw your name on a paper on this exact question, so I think you might be well placed.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump into this one. Thanks. Yeah, it's something we've been thinking a lot about at our institute, and it's significant overlap with what Martin was talking about there. Like, there's multiple lines of defense concept. I think maps on really well to the AI value chain as well. I think one of the challenges that we've had with the EU AI Act is indeed probably a focus on sort of just the deployment phase, because they took the product safety lens. So in basically all the research we've been doing, in the institute, we're constantly finding that actually it's much more complex than that. You know, risk can originate at any point in the value chain. You know, so there's not really a one size fits all answer around where to assign accountability. But what is clear is that it should be allocated along the value chain. So I think to take some examples of that, you know, decisions made at the design and development phase around, you know, which data that you feed into the model when you're training it, that for sure will have some impact on sort of outputs, even at the application layer when it's being deployed. So I think thinking about in that sense where the risk originates is one useful sort of one useful concept to pin to. So risk origin is very important. That can sort of be across the value chain, and risk proliferation as well is also, I think, a key one for regulators to hone in on. So you know, risk can originate anywhere, but then it may proliferate, for example, once it's uploaded to a cloud hosting service, when it's provided via API access. You know, that's really when something that could be harmful can be sort of amplified by giving wider accessibility. So I think that also is useful for regulators, because that can create a sort of useful point of intervention potentially to sort of say, where does the risk originate, and how can we sort of mitigate some of that. So yeah, I think that's probably the best way to think about it. You know, we can't say clearly one size fits all, but it needs to be shared, and it needs to be very targeted around where the risk originates. I think there's actually, like, you know, some very interesting governance models that we can look at to learn from other sectors how they do this type of thing. I think the 3 lines of defense just spoken about is one interesting thing that we can learn from. I also think sort of regulation of life sciences in the US is one that we've been looking at recently. You know, a lot of people talk about what an FDA for AI would look like, and we're going to publish research on that in the next few days. I think you can learn a lot there, because the key thing, and this kind of gets to what Martin was mentioning, the AI Safety Institute, what it does well is that you can find a way to get access to high value information, and this starts to address the information asymmetry that we see between developers and regulators. This is something that they do very well in the US Food and Drug Administration to regulate medical devices, for example. There is the ability for regulators to get access to information, even information around decisions taken at design and development. And they have this ongoing relationship throughout the life cycle between the developer and the regulator. So there's options to do some more explorative scrutiny. There's options to have very targeted scrutiny based on, you know, specific standards. So I think this is like a good way to address value chains where risk origination is very unclear. And it's also a good way for a regulator to like learn and upskill over time by finding sort of checkpoints where you can get access to high value information. So I think, yeah, there's a significant accountability pre-market on the developers and deployers. Then I think when you get to that post-market stage as well, you probably need a very strong regulator that can go and look at risk throughout the life cycle. We also think, and this probably gets to the second and third line of defense, a lot of that should be supported by what we call at ADA, like an ecosystem of inspection. So that would be access for auditors, as Martin mentioned. Also could be access for, you know, vetted red teamers is one concept that they looked at in the AI Act. But I think the main challenge there is the question of incentives. And I'd actually be very interested to learn from other panelists, like what those incentives look like in other industries, because in our opinion, we think you need to give some of those incentives in the regulation itself. So actually setting some obligations to have independent audits, or to have sort of adversarial testing with vetted red teamers. The AI Act probably will not have those things, but I wonder then what the incentives are, because providers might not necessarily open up to that type of scrutiny without giving a regulatory hook for that. So I think that's something that we are going to be thinking a lot about sort of moving forward. What ways can you incentivize this sort of ecosystem inspection to grow? Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think that was very comprehensive and gives everyone a bit of an idea of the different elements at play here. We have a question from the audience that says, Are you working on a mapping document which maps an NIST risk management framework to the EU AI Act? Chloe, I can see that you.
And I really quickly, I was going to hit type answer and then I accidentally hit answer live.
Oh,
And
sorry to put you on the spot there. I think people might find that very interesting. So please.
No worries. I went off mute anyways, and I was going to say that I'm sure that multiple people are working on this, but given some of the work and sort of focus of the other panelists, maybe I'll let them address it. But I was just going to say, you know, there have been so many different mapping exercises with the RMF, with the EU AI Act, with various other proposals, and I'm happy to pull up a few like resources and you know, share them with you all so that you can have them. But sorry about that, my bad on the Zoom user error.
Oh no, it would not be a Zoom without at least one little yeah.
What I would say about that is that I mean, even if such a document existed, you know, it's not going to be the case that at some point in the future we're going to get total legal certainty about what the requirements everyone has in any particular jurisdiction. This point will never arise. It's always going to be dynamic, and so we're always going to be operating with a certain amount of uncertainty and need to get comfortable to that. And I think part of the solution is actually just in terms of developing one's own standards that's specific to your own context. To go back to the beginning, the sort of narrative sort of conversations we would have been having on this webinar 2 or 3 years ago, where we would have been talking about all the high level principles, you know, transparency and accountability and all that. And then instead of just leaving it to the policymakers to work it out a bit yourself for your own context, and then define some of your own standards and create an audit trail against those standards. And you can use that audit trail, Connor, when you want to give transparency for accountability for every stage of the life cycle. But I would caution anyone away from the idea that if only they could sort of chuck the different jurisdictions, standards and requirements into an LLM, or there's probably a startup idea there, and then get a kind of like fully mapped document that all they need to do then is check all the boxes and they're good. Never going to happen, because this is going to be a dynamic environment and you probably need to take a bit more ownership of precisely the story you want to tell.
I actually completely agree, and a very shameless plug. We're going to be putting out a free AI policy guide very shortly, where it touches on exactly these points, where you need to tailor some of these frameworks to your organization and actually really go through and understand what matters to you. It's not a case of just rolling things off the shelf. You've got to tailor it to your organization, how you're set up. So great point. We'll be releasing that white paper shortly. Just to touch on actually one of the questions there, because I think it's a really good one, and I might be able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone on this, because there's a question here around intellectual property and how intellectual property in this area is going to play out. I think it's a really interesting debate. And to Connor's point on incentives, I think incentives are also a key consideration in all of this. And the incentives are not always what you might think. So to give an example of how this is currently playing out with regards, there's of course deep intellectual property concerns with a lot of these large foundational models, because they've just pulled their data from absolutely everywhere. What you're seeing some of the larger providers in this do that own big data sets already is put out intellectual property indemnities, and they're saying, look, we're going to indemnify you against any kind of claim that anyone may ever bring that you've breached intellectual property laws anywhere in the world, because we are so certain that we own all of the data that this model was trained on, that we just don't, like, that's never going to happen, so we can confidently give you this indemnity. And that is inspiring quite a lot of trust in those types of products. So rather than waiting for specific rules to do with intellectual property and these big models, organizations kind of taking the initiative there and saying, right, we're going to take this risk out of the customer's hand entirely, so we're going to make our tools trustworthy, I think is really, really compelling. And it just shows you how sometimes the incentives are slightly a little bit different than you might initially expect them to play out. And similarly, I think you can look towards the cybersecurity area, where there's a lot of high standards around that SaaS, software as a service businesses, need to meet, such as ISO 27001 and SOC 2, that are not required by regulators, but the incentives are there in the market for organizations to comply, because no one's going to buy your software if they don't think you comply with the highest possible levels of cybersecurity standards to protect their data. So there can be that market incentive. Sometimes it's overlooked rather than just a regulatory compliance incentive.
Would anyone like to add anything at this point on, are we happy to move forward? Okay, I'll take this silence as let's keep going. So I think it would be interesting to hear a bit more about how organizations can extend exactly like what they already have for data protection, their approach, and utilize that for AI governance. Is that something that Martin, perhaps you can expand a bit more? I know we already touched on it earlier today.
Sure. Well, I think my message was there that a large amount of this is like a comms job, basically, because it's all very well. Everyone likes to sort of talk about working on an interdisciplinary basis, but actually achieving that in practice can be rather a challenge because it kind of entails trade-offs between different people's goals. So, you know, the lawyers will always see sort of maximum liability risk. The security people will always. So I'll give you a case study. So recently we were talking about, well, we want to be more transparent about, publish a kind of, you know, model card about one of the things we're doing. And I spoke to the security people and they said, well, no, we can't possibly say what type of model it is because, you know, that'll increase the attack space and make it more vulnerable. So, you know, it was a bit of a challenge to say, okay, but it's a trade-off here between security and explainability, isn't there? Just like there's a trade-off between accuracy and fairness, and et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the kind of challenges to get people brought into using these functions as they stand, but seeing it in a more holistic way. And back to this point about accountability, trying to get people to understand that you can't, accountability for AI risk can't reside in any one area. It's not only a technology thing or only a legal thing or only a risk thing or whatever, whereas that's kind of the traditional paradigm of how risk management is done. And this is why, by the way, in the executive order, the idea of having chief AI officers is a terrible idea. Because that is sort of giving people excuse to sort of say, oh, it's that person over there who bears all accountability for AI risk. So I think there's a lot of sort of there's a kind of internal communications and kind of leadership piece. Quite frankly, you need to get your most senior people involved in it, and also that people raise their sights up a little bit, their own kind of business areas and their own objectives, and work a bit on its interdisciplinary basis. I will tell you a little bit about one of the gaps that does emerge perhaps is around model risk specifically. So even if you have the most perfect data in the world, you can still have models which spit out sort of wrong kind of answers. And that is an area where it does make sense to partner with some of the vendors out there who have got some interesting solutions for how to manage this sort of thing. Enzai are great and other vendors are available. I'm going to have to answer the door now because my son has just turned up. I'll be back in a second.
Yeah, no worries. I actually had a question for Chloe, something you touched on earlier, because the executive order is really interesting. I think it's going to have a huge impact, but there's a lot of initiatives at the state level as well in the US, isn't there? I'm thinking particularly of like New York local law 144 in the HR. They seem to be state level and they seem to be focused on specific industries. How do you think that's all of those moves are going to interact with the wider federal piece?
Yeah, it's a really good point to bring up. We're going to see a ton of state activity next year, particularly in the absence of congressional action. And I know that there's been a ton of focus on Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in the Senate's, AI Insight forums. I'm sure everyone has read a lot about those. He's convened about 10 different sort of focused roundtables with leading AI experts, and then, kind of focused other discussions on discrete topics like transparency and explainability and national security and bias and civil rights, that sort of thing. But the political realities in Washington are what they are, right? We have a big election coming up next year, a very consequential election. And I can talk about that a little bit too, as I recall that was sort of part of the first question. But I think it's really, really unlikely, even if we make some great progress in the Senate on legislation informed by the Insight forums and the executive order implementation, that we'll actually have some sort of bill cross the finish line that will be really sort of comprehensive comprehensive or really address a lot of the harms that we're concerned about with AI. And so in that void, a lot of states have already begun to step in. You mentioned New York, passed New York City, to be specific, passed local law 144, which requires bias audits for any kind of use of AI hiring technology, both for hiring, but also for employment. So if you're doing any sort of worker monitoring or interviews or check-in that's facilitated by AI, you're going to have to perform a bias audit. And like a lot of these laws, implementation of that is still sort of being sorted out. But we'll see a lot of this, I think, both sector specific and then sort of bolstering AI talent and efficiency in state government type bills. So to just touch on the sector specific bills really quickly, in Colorado, we have an insurance law, actually, AI and insurance. So really looking at how data sources are used and how data is analyzed through AI for insurance decisions. And that's actually a law on the books now. So implementation is happening as we speak. And then Connecticut, actually the state of Connecticut, a leader there actually in state policy, Senator James Maroney, has introduced, and I think in the previous session, and has been working really closely with actually a number of other states on an interstate sort of AI working group, and really bringing a bunch of different lawmakers together at the state level who are really concerned about these issues, whether it's in the context of bias and discrimination or election integrity, right? What are the implications for AI as we head into this next year with elections? These state lawmakers are really concerned about these issues. And I think because of, really like I said, the realities of a larger bill or a larger package passing on AI in the federal Congress, they're really leaning in on getting smart on these issues, and we'll see a lot more action there. And really quickly, just to answer the first part of the question that we had on, how the executive order will be impacted by the election. I'm well aware that the Biden administration is really, really focused on implementing as much of this executive order as they possibly can leading up to the election year. And as we go into the election year, right? And particularly also just in the context of the last executive order on AI, again, not really quite hitting the mark when it reached implementation, or when it came to implementation. And so it'll be really interesting to see what happens next year with the election. Trump himself has already actually come out of the campaign trail and said, on day one, I will repeal President Biden's woke AI executive order to protect free speech. Despite your political leanings, I think these are all very predictable talking points and positions. And so I guess my takeaway here was that it would be that, for anyone saying, well, AI policy, AI governance, it's not really a political issue. It definitely is, and it will continue to become that way, particularly as we head into this election. So lots to watch on the federal level. More importantly, pay attention to what's going on in the states, because I think there's a lot of, up and coming elected officials who are really interested in working on these issues.
That's fascinating. And now that you mentioned elections, there's elections in Europe next year as well. How's that going to affect the EU AI Act, Connor? And the timeline for it, particularly for coming into effect?
Yeah, I'm hoping it won't affect it at all. There's a small chance that it could affect it. I think they need to finish the sort of technical drafting of the text by March latest, so that wouldn't be implicated or impacted by the election. So work will basically stop from March onwards. Right now, it's looking like they can for sure do that within that time. I don't anticipate hiccups. There might be, if there was significant pushback, maybe those from France have voiced some concerns with the AI Act, how it landed last week. Maybe if France was to intervene in some sort of in a destructive manner, I guess, to try and block the act, then you run the risk of no agreement by March. That would mean work is postponed until 2025, realistically, from what I understand, which would be messy, to say the least, because then you would have new parliamentarians elected, might not be the same people in the parliament, so you would have new people picking up the file with different priorities. So yeah, let's say I hope the election will not impact it very much, and if things go as they're as they should, then it won't impact the act very much.
And assuming they do go as they should, what are the timeline are we looking at for businesses to start complying with this?
Yeah, so there is a 2-year entry into application after publication in the official journal of the EU. So that's to say, early 2024 they will probably publish the text. So that means 2026 for most AI applications to early 2026 to become compliant. Where that is different is for these general purpose AI models with systemic risk. So they're aiming to have those coming into application in 1 year after it's published, so early 2025. They would start this code of practice for systemic models that I mentioned earlier 3 months after the publication. So you would have sort of a 9-month period kind of aiming to get that code of practice drafted, and then the rules for general purpose AI coming in within 1 year, because they see that as a bit more urgent. So yeah, I think for businesses, that's the main one to note. For 2 years for most businesses, and then for these systemic models, 1 year.
It's really not a huge amount of time. Because I like for the time I've been working on this company now, it's been like 2 years, and it's gone like that. So it just goes so fast. But listen, I'm conscious we're nearly at time here, so I'll pass back to Karen for some concluding remarks.
Yes, so we're almost at the hour now. And this concludes a very insightful discussion on the responsible development and governance of AI systems. We've discussed accountability. I think there's a lot of things for all of us to read after this as well and catch up on what's going on. I wanted to sincerely thank all of our panelists, so Connor, Martin, Chloe, Ryan, for sharing your perspective and your expertise. And also extend a big thank you to all of our attendees joining us. And I invite all of you to continue this dialogue on our event page, online, on social media. So thank you very much.